Good day. As I discussed in my program yesterday, the two missile strikes that have taken place against the Houthi militia in Yemen, the two missile strikes that were conducted by the United States and Britain, have taken away attention from the fact that the Russians carried out a missile strike of their own over the same period against various targets in Ukraine. And I said in my program yesterday that I would wait until we got more information before I discussed that Russian missile strike in more detail. Now, we have some information now coming through about this missile strike, and I'm going to discuss it. And I'm going to say, first of all, that it is extremely bad, ominous news for Ukraine. But before I do that, I just wanted to make a point, which no doubt others are making before. This is another in what now seems to be a 5-day sequence of missile strikes. We had a missile strike on the 29th of December. Then there was a follow-up missile strike on the 3rd of January. That was the biggest in the series by far. Then there was another smaller missile strike on the 8th of January, which nonetheless was a very powerful one. And we've had the next missile strike in the series on the 13th of January, a missile strike by the Russians against targets in Ukraine taking place every 5 days. Now, I don't think that this is chance. I think that the Russians have probably calibrated their missile strikes so that they take place over 5 days. My guess is that they need 5 days in order to bring in all the analysis, get all the information from the sites that they've attacked, work out exactly what is happening, what targets have been damaged, how extensive the damage has been, work out where further Ukrainian air defense positions are located. And then after that period of 5 days, they launch another strike, building on what was achieved by the previous strikes. So I think this is, as I said, a clear pattern. And it is an interesting one because it is very different from the pattern which the Russians followed last year, this time last year. This time last year, during the winter campaign, which was, as we all remember, targeting the Ukrainian energy system, though, as I have said previously, I think it is now clear that the major objective of the Russians last year was not the energy system as such. They may come back to that later. That's something that only the Russian High Command knows. But the main purpose of the Russian missile strikes last winter was to deplete the Ukrainian air defense system, which was based around S-300 and Buk missile systems left over to Ukraine from the period of the Soviet Union. This is a very elaborate, powerful air defense system which Ukraine inherited from the Soviet Union. It took a long time for the Russians to break it down, but as is now clear, they eventually did. I say that because over the course of the recent missile strikes, one of the most interesting facts is that we no longer hear of Ukrainian S-300 missiles or Buk missiles being used in any quantity. They do occasionally get launched, but on nothing like the scale that we were seeing last winter. The missiles that Ukraine is using now are the various air defense systems that the Western powers provided to Ukraine, the Patriots, the NASAMS, the IRIS-Ts, and things like that. We see these are much more visible now than the S-300s and the Buk systems that were so prevalent in Ukraine earlier in the war. So that Russian missile campaign last winter was successful in its purpose, but it was conducted in a different way from the way in which the current missile campaign is being conducted. Last winter, the Russians were not so much targeting Ukrainian air defense positions. They were targeting the energy system. They were sending missiles towards the energy system, the power stations, the transfer lines, all of those things, and obliging the Ukrainians to launch large numbers of S-300 missiles and Buk missiles to try to intercept these Russian missiles. And as I was saying at the time, it's clear to me that the Ukrainians were exaggerating their success. They were claiming many more Russian cruise missiles shot down than were actually being shot down. But the point was that they were having to launch two missiles, two air defense missiles, S-300s, Buk missiles, for every one cruise missile that they were targeting. And of course, that meant that they ran through their remaining stock of S-300 and Buk missiles very fast. Now, that was last year. And the interesting thing about the way in which the Russian missile campaign was being conducted over the course of last winter is that typically the Russians would launch around 100 missiles, sometimes a little less, never more, as I remember, 80 to 100 missiles in one big strike, and that would happen roughly once each month. They did not conduct strikes in the way that they are doing now over a period when there's a strike every 5 days. And again, this perhaps suggests, this obviously suggests that the Russians had fewer missiles last winter than they do today, which is why they're able to launch strikes of the kind that they're doing on a more regular basis, on a more frequent basis, on a much more frequent basis. But perhaps it also suggests a change of tactics, that having depleted the Ukrainian air defense system successfully last winter, the Russians this time are approaching the business of destroying Ukraine's Western supplied air defense system in a different way, this time by actually targeting the launchers and the missile batteries and the radar stations. And this is probably what explains the greater frequency. Now, there is something else, which is that the Russians are this time launching attacks in a much more sophisticated and complex way. Last winter, Russian missile attacks on Ukraine were conducted almost exclusively using subsonic Kh-101 cruise missiles launched from the Tupolev 95 bombers and Kalibr missiles launched from Russian warships in the Black Sea. Every so often, the Russians would supplement these subsonic missiles with supersonic Kh-22 or 32 missiles, these huge missiles launched by the Tupolev 22 M3 bombers, which are able to do colossal damage on any target that they crash into. I mean, the size of these missiles is enormous. They were, of course, originally designed to destroy US Navy carriers, so one can understand why they are as big as they actually are. So, but those big missiles were only used on a relatively occasional basis. As I said, overwhelmingly, the missile strikes last winter were with subsonic, jet-powered cruise missiles, the KH-101s and the Calibres. Now it is very different. First of all, we get waves of missiles being sent, and often we get different missiles being used. So we also get drones, Uranium-2 drones, increasingly used. They are very much now integrated into these missile strikes. Normally, what happens is that the first wave of attacks is carried out by Uranium-2 drones, whose purpose, I suspect, is to try to force the Ukrainians to launch their missiles, their air defense missiles, revealing the location of their batteries, these air defense missile batteries. There are no doubt Russian aircraft able to spying and observing where the air defense missiles are launched from, tracking where the radars are located, the ones that are identifying the Uranium-2s. And it's easy to guess what kind of aircraft these are. Probably advanced surveillance drones are operating. Again, I don't know very much about this, but I suspect that the Russians have more of these things than people know about. Anyway, advanced surveillance drones are probably operating, but also the Beriev AWACS aircraft. They're probably tracking the movement, the launch points of missiles. Maybe satellites. I mean, I'm not an expert at all in these things. And however it's done, the Russians are able that way to get information about the launch points of these missiles in real time. And then after the Uranium-2s, normally we get the subsonic cruise missiles, the KH-101s, and the Calibres. And I think in most cases, those target various industrial facilities. And then at the very end, as this battle continues, there's more missiles launched. This time, it seems a combination of ballistic missiles, ground-launched ballistic missiles. In my opinion, almost certainly, almost entirely, Iskander M ground-launched ballistic missiles. But if you want to believe that the Russians also using North Korean missiles, I've seen no real evidence of this. Well, that's up, that's, I mean, I don't know definitely one way or the other. But as I said, ballistic missiles, hypersonic Kinjal missiles, and very interestingly, an increasing number of KH-31M air-launch anti-radar missiles launched by Russian aircraft. And I noticed, by the way, that a channel which is associated with the Russian Ministry of Defense and which does programs detailing various Russian weapon systems, combat approved, has recently posted a rather interesting program about the KH-31M and the way it is being actually used over the course of the Ukraine war, and discussing its capabilities and making great play of the fact, by the way, that it is largely made from titanium. But anyway, I'm not going to get into the details of all of that. And as I've discussed before, these KH-31s are clearly targeting the ground radars, the Ukrainian ground radars. And most probably, they're targeting the Iron Dome ASAR radars donated by Israel to Ukraine. Apparently, they were created with US involvement. The US has some kind of ownership of these radars. The US supplied them to Ukraine. There's lots of speculation that they're operated by, at least in part, by people trained in the West, or at least in NATO, not just Ukrainians, in other words. And I suspect the Russians are hunting these particular radars. Now, again, in saying all of that, before I proceed, I need to acknowledge my debt to a particular source, the source which first confirmed that these Iron Dome radars are present in Ukraine and are forming an integral part of this air defense system, and who has also confirmed the way in which the Russians are currently hunting them. Of course, it isn't just the air defense system that the Russians are targeting. They are also targeting military industrial facilities. And this time, again, the objectives are different than they were last winter. Because last winter, the attacks on the energy system were not so much an attempt to knock out the energy system itself. It is now clear that the facilities that the Russians were attacking last winter were secondary elements of the energy system, so that once repaired, the energy system could be put back into operation. This time, however, the Russians are clearly targeting military industrial plants which are actually participating in the Ukrainian war effort. Now, the Russians made a major campaign, undertook a major campaign against Ukraine's military industries back in February and March 2022. They then refocused their missile campaign on other targets, but they've now again going after the these industrial facilities again with a vengeance, because it's clear that the Ukrainians have had some success in getting some of these production facilities restarted, and because as Western aid rapidly dwindles, Ukraine is being thrown back increasingly on relying on these industrial plants in order to keep its war effort going. And we've had quite a lot of evidence that important industrial facilities have been damaged. And one of the industrial plants that the Russians hit and perhaps inflicted significant damage upon in the very last strike was a factory, apparently the one factory Ukraine has, which is able to make explosives of the kind that Ukraine would need to engage in shell production, production for artillery shells, where supply of artillery shells from the West is now dwindling, and where Ukraine is experiencing a shell shortage. So the Russians have attacked the most important factory in some respects, the one that produces the explosives that link up with whatever industrial structure Ukraine is creating in order to try to continue the supply of to maintain a supply of artillery shells to its troops. So this time, unlike the winter, the ultimate targets for these strikes are not just secondary to the main objective of undermining, of degrading the Ukrainian air defense system. They are important targets, clearly important targets in themselves. So all of that leads us now to the question, how successful was this last strike? Well, as I understand it, Ukraine says that 37 missiles of various descriptions, including Kinjal missiles, were launched at Ukraine on the 13th of January. Out of those 37, Ukraine claims that it shot down just 8. So, previously, last winter, Ukraine was regularly claiming that it was able to shoot down up to 90% or sometimes more than 90% of the missiles that the Russians launched. I've said that that was actually partly the Russian objective, to get the Ukrainians to launch missiles, claim victory when they shot down Russian missiles, but in the process depleting their own air defense system. So the Russians would not have been too troubled if quite a lot of their missiles were shot down, though it's important to stress I have always been skeptical about Ukrainian claims that they did in fact shoot down that many Russian missiles. But the fact is, given that the purpose was to deplete the air defense system, the more air defense missiles Ukraine launched, the more Russian missiles it claimed to have shot down. In a sense, the better it would have been for the Russians in terms of achieving their objectives. This time, however, it's different. The Ukrainians have basically given up pretending that they're having much success in shooting down Russian missiles. They're no longer claiming that they're able to shoot down Kinjals in any quantity. The Kinjals are all getting through. This is also the case with this last attack. The KH-32s, they now admit, have always managed to get through. It looks as if this time the Ukrainians even acknowledge that most of the subsonic missiles, the KH-101s and the Calibres, got through also. And in summary, what we are looking at is the collapse of Ukraine's air defense system right across Ukraine as a result of what are clearly much more sophisticated missile strikes by the Russians, and also the fragility of this Western supply system, which clearly does not have the resilience that the old Soviet supply system, Soviet legacy system that Ukraine was previously using once had. By the way, let me repeat again what I've said before. Brian Boletic at the New Atlas largely predicted all of this, and it's fascinating to see how events have played out very much in the way that he said they would. Now, there is something else. If the Russians are able to launch attacks every 5 days, and I want to stress, I doubt that they will be able to sustain this tempo of strikes every 5 days indefinitely. But the fact is they are launching strikes every 5 days at the moment. If they're able to do that, then, as I said, it does point to production of missiles having increased very substantially over the period since last winter. And note that the Russians are launching many, many more Kinjal missiles than they did earlier in the war. And of course, it is these Kinjal missiles along with the KH-32s, which when they strike do the most damage. I mean, the power of these missiles when they hit targets is astonishing. You can see that by just seeing the enormous explosions that take place. So we have confirmation that Russian production of missiles has indeed increased by a substantial margin, and it seems also that production of hypersonic Kinjal missiles has increased in volumes very, very considerably. So the Russians have far more hypersonic missiles to use, Kinjal missiles, than they did last winter. And they're now regularly used and are being used to devastating effect. And as a matter of fact, Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, recently visited a missile factory in Russia, and TASS, the official Russian news agency, on the 12th of January, had this to say about his visit. The volume of products made by a number of units of the Tactical Missiles Corporation have climbed threefold due to an increase in labor productivity by 40%, the Russian Defense Ministry reported following Minister Sergei Shoigu's visit to one of the corporation's enterprises. Head of one of the units of the enterprise, Dmitry Kovalyov, told Russian Defense Minister that due to an increase in labor productivity by 40% and the switch to a 12-hour shift, the volumes of products made by the section key heads have soared threefold. And latest patterns of high-precision warheads that were put into serial production in 2023, as well as promising samples of arms, were also presented to the minister during the visit. Now, this is an interesting report. It's not quite saying that production of missiles overall has trebled, but it is saying that production of certain types of missiles has trebled or more than trebled. It's a reasonable guess. I'm going to make a guess that production of the subsonic missiles, the KH-101 and Calibre, has probably increased, but that the big surge is in production of the hypersonic missiles, the Kinjal. And we're told that Shoigu was shown promising samples of arms, and that the latest patterns of high-precision warheads that were put into serial production in 2023 were also shown to him. The Kinjal entered production before 2023, so latest patterns of high-precision warheads that were put into serial production in 2023. What could that be? I suspect that that is an allusion, a reference to the Zircon hypersonic ramjet-powered or scramjet-powered cruise missile. Apparently that's, well, we happen to know that that is in serial production. Output of it is increasing alongside with that of all of the other missiles. And I, for one, predict that we're going to start to see it being used in the area of the special military operation before very long. It would be surprising if the Russians, having built up a stock of these missiles, they're busy re-equipping some of their warships with them. By the way, the two Admiral Gorshkov class frigates that are already in service with the Russian Navy. Anyway, once there's a sufficiently big stock of these missiles, I would be surprised if the Russians didn't have some plans to use them in the area of the special military operation. They do have a secondary land attack role, as well as their primary anti-ship role. And I would have thought that the Russians would want to test them and to see how effective they are when used against land targets, including air defense batteries. So, altogether, a disastrous picture for Ukraine. The West's ability to go on supplying Ukraine with air defense systems is probably now exhausted. The United States is plunging into a secondary conflict in the Middle East. It's got a looming crisis in the Asia Pacific region over Taiwan. I'll discuss this in a little more detail at the end of this program. There aren't enough Patriot missile interceptors to go around, and it's difficult to see why the United States would anyway want to go on supplying Patriot air defense missiles to Ukraine when all that is happening is that the Russians are either destroying them or they get burnt up through overuse by Ukraine. So, not only are Russian missile attacks becoming more frequent and more devastating, not only is Ukraine's ability to counter these missile strikes by the Russians diminishing, even according to Ukraine's own admissions, but we are probably going to get even more powerful missile strikes with even more powerful missiles coming at some point over the course of the next few months. Now, before I leave this topic of missiles, there is one person who has served with NATO. He has provided me with valuable information in the past. Again, I have to be very careful not to give any clue as to his identity. And I should say that in what he's saying, he's not basing it on any information that he's been given. He's working from open source material, as I understand it, but applying, of course, his own very great experience. And in the past, he has provided commentary, effectively debunking these persistent Ukrainian claims that the Russians are using air defense missiles, converted S-300 missiles, to conduct ground strikes. He has said that this just simply doesn't make sense for the Russians to do. The air defense missiles are hardly designed for that role. And given that the Russians have plenty of ballistic missiles specifically designed for ground use, why would the Russians even want to do that? Anyway, this person has now provided me with a very detailed discussion, commentary about the latest Ukrainian claims that the Russians are using S-400 air defense missiles in this way, the S-400 being a much more sophisticated missile than the previous S-300s. And, well, again, I don't want to go into the detail of the information he's provided me, but I would say that I found it absolutely convincing, and I agree with his view that the Russians are not using S-400 missiles in that way. That's to say, once again, I'm getting invaluable advice and information from members of the community, and I want to thank all of those who do that. Without this information, I would not be able to make these programs, or at least not in the kind of way that I in fact do. So a devastating missile strike on Ukraine, one that's causing enormous damage, one which Ukraine has no real ability to counter. And I should say that the situation from the battlefronts is also darkening. Now, I said that over the Christmas period, and remember again, in Russia, Christmas Day is on the 7th of January, but the week after, there were indications that there was a lull in the fighting. And in one of my recent programs, I said that it's now clear that that lull has passed. And in fact, we're now getting information about ever more aggressive operations by the Russians on the battlefronts. And firstly, and here I'm going to say I'm drawing this information from essentially two sources. One is Slavyangrad. I've discussed them many times. Telegram channel. They make no secret of the fact that they are, that they favor Russia, but they strive to be objective in their assessments of operations. They're often very critical of what the Russian military is doing in any particular place. I've never known them to sugarcoat Russian failures or Russian retreats. And they also provide a lot of analysis of what is happening. So I'm basing this partly on them. I am straightforwardly admitting that I follow a lot of what Dima says at the Military Summary channel. I find his daily updates extremely valuable, even if from time to time, and of course I should say I know Dima and he knows me and we're good friends, even if from time to time I don't always necessarily agree with his analysis of what happens. I mean, he's obviously someone with much more knowledge and he has his finger on the pulse of things, much more so than I do. But from time to time, I have a right to take a slightly different view. Anyway, let's just go over the information we're getting from those battlefronts. And I should say, I don't just get my information from those two sources, but they are perhaps the two sources I use much more than others, and which I find rational and sensible. But anyway, firstly, it looks as if the battles around Kupiansk are now restarting. The Russians pulled back from Sinkovka just before the Christmas holiday. They seem to be now back with a vengeance. They've been releasing films of attacks, not in Sinkovka itself, but of armored vehicles, Ukrainian armored vehicles, to the south of Sinkovka. It looks as if some of the Russian attacks on Sinkovka, this is an analysis I'm taking from Dima, by the way, with which I do agree, that some of the Russian attacks on Sinkovka were intended to lure the Ukrainians into bringing out their reserves. And the result is that Ukrainian tanks, armored vehicles, and such things were caught in the open, and the Russians were able to hammer them with their artillery and their kamikaze drones, the Lancets, and all of those. And the Russians have provided quite a lot of film of heavy Ukrainian losses of armored vehicles in the Sinkovka area. And it's likely that at some point over the next couple of days, as Dima correctly says, we will see a further Russian push in the Kupiansk area. So here again, we see the way in which the Russians conduct what I've referred to as aggressive attrition. They've launched attacks on Sinkovka itself. They've goaded the Ukrainians into launching counterattacks, deploying forces closer to the contact line. in order to repel the Russian attacks, bringing forward their reserves. And that's exactly what the Russians want, because that makes it possible for the Russians to attack those armored units, attack those reserves, and cause further depletion of Ukrainian units on the battlefront and burning up Ukrainian reserves in the process. And also, we've had more reports from the Bakhmut area. It seems that the Russians have managed to make more progress around Klishchiivka, in the area of Klishchiivka, pushing, no doubt, towards Ivanivska, this further village. And there's some reports that I've seen that the Russians are also making further progress in the Bogdanovka Popovoye forest area. This is a complex encounter battle. And again, I'm not going to pretend that I understand it particularly well. But if we go further south in the Avdiivka area, a number of things appear to be happening all at once, which point to, again, a severely deteriorating situation for the Ukrainians. Firstly, it seems that the Russians are now well advanced in the process of trying to capture this village of Pervomaisky to the southwest of Avdiivka. But it also seems that they made significant gains around Stepovoye. They appear to control significant areas around that intensely contested village. And there's now film which appears to show that confirm that the Russians are in control of the greater part of Stepovoye itself. Now, that would not, in my opinion, be particularly significant in and of itself. There's been battles for Stepovoye going on for weeks. It's changed hands many times. The Ukrainians repeatedly attack or counterattack to try to recapture Stepovoye. As I've discussed in many videos, this is consistent again with the Russian tactic of aggressive attrition. Taking ground, goading the Ukrainians to counterattack, using the counterattacks to strike at Ukrainian reserves, allowing the Ukrainians no rest, and then, of course, going back on the attack again once the Ukrainians have either regained the ground that they lost or been repelled. So, keeping the Ukrainians busy all the time. But anyway, it now looks as if things are starting to change importantly in the area of Stepovoye and northwest of Avdiivka and along the railway. The Russians have pushed up quite a significant distance up the railway. And I mean, there's still quite a way to go before they reach Ocheretenya, which may be their ultimate objective. But it looks as if this Russian advance up the railway has stretched Ukrainian defense positions. They've had to, no doubt, deploy more forces to this area to try to hold back the Russian advances in various places. But importantly, the Russians have now renewed their assault, not just on Stepovoye, but on the areas to the north and south of it, and perhaps pushing more towards Berdichi. And there has been a video circulating, it's been provided by Ukraine, which is very interesting and which I would suggest actually shows an alarming situation for Ukraine. Now, this video has been much commented upon, it's been much discussed on the Ukrainian side, and understandably why, because in a sense it shows a tactical success for the Ukrainians. That shows a Russian T-90M tank operating in Stepovoye, somewhere to the central or western part of Stepovoye. It is then ambushed by 3 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, presumably operating for the 47th Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. After a battle, an encounter battle, 1 Bradley is damaged, but the T-90M is destroyed. And in and of itself, that would suggest, as I said, a Ukrainian tactical success. Let's just take a step back and think of what this means. What it means is that Russian tanks, T-90Ms, are operating west of the railway. The Russians have been able to deploy heavy armor tanks west of the railway. Every so often, the Ukrainians are able to destroy one. But remember, the Russians have busy production lines. They are producing tanks. According to various Russian officials, they built 1,500 new tanks or refurbished tanks last year. So they're able to produce large numbers of tanks every month, over 100 tanks every month. Probably those production numbers are growing. And by the way, what I'm hearing, and I have no way of confirming this, is that out of those 1,500 tanks that are new and refurbished tanks that Russia is producing every year, or produced last year, around half were entirely new tanks, T-90Ms, and the other half were heavily refurbished T-72s and T-80s, and perhaps some T-62s, principally supplied to the Donbass militia forces. So the Russians are able to replace their losses of tanks, and quite likely in 2024 they're going to increase tank production even further, so they can well afford to lose the odd tank. The key point about the battle in Stepovoye is not that they lost a tank, but that they now have tanks, heavy tanks, operating west of the railway in Stepovoye itself, pushing towards BITCHUTE. And if we go back to an article that was published by the Spanish newspaper El País about 2 months ago, I recall a Ukrainian soldier saying that if the Russians, a soldier from the 47th Mechanized Brigade, that if the Russians are able to start moving tanks and armored vehicles in quantity west of the railway line which is just to the east of where Stepovoye is situated, if they're able to start doing that, then it is very bad news for Ukraine, because eventually those tanks and armored vehicles will be able to close the top of the sock, where the toe, if you like, is where Avdiivka itself is located. And some weeks ago, we started to see signs that the Russians were successful in getting the odd armored vehicle west of the railway. But now things have progressed to the point where Russian tanks, or at least one Russian tank, probably more than one Russian tank, has been able to cross the railway. So, if there is a build-up of Russian armor west of the railway, if the Russians are able to consolidate their control in this area, then based on what that Ukrainian soldier was saying to El Pais, the days of Avdiivka are numbered. And what the New York Times was saying yesterday, the slow encirclement of Avdiivka, well, that slow encirclement might gain in speed. So we might be closer to that point. The presence of that tank shows not just that the Russians are stronger than they have been before in the Stepovoye area and are gaining ground around it, but that they're now able to send tanks across the railway, and quite plausibly they will send more. And that's a very bad situation for Ukraine, obviously. And I would add that there's also been some reports of further fighting within Avdiivka itself. The Russians have apparently published pictures of strikes with FPV drones and kamikaze drones inside Avdiivka. I'm not able to assess the significance of that, but what we do see, as I said, is a deterioration of the Ukrainian situation in Avdiivka. And further south, in the Marinka area, again, more reports of the Russians now apparently pushing into the western part of Georgievka, this village to the west of Marinka, which lies between the Russians and Kurahovo, which is apparently a small town, which is an important logistic hub for the Ukrainians, and which they need to retain control of in order to keep their garrison in Vuhledar supplied. At least that's what some reports say. But also, there's been significant reports now that the Russians are gradually weaving their way around Novomikhailivka, that they're gradually encircling Novomikhailivka, this village to the south of Marinka. I've never completely understood what the significance of this village is, but clearly both the Russians and the Ukrainians think it's important because the Russians are committing significant forces to capturing it, and the Ukrainians are committing significant forces to defending it. And it's clear that the Russians are gradually, incrementally bringing this entire village into a semicircle, and perhaps they will present once again the Ukrainians with the dilemma: do they go on holding on in Novomikhailivka, or do they pull their troops out and cede control of this village to the Russians? This is one point, by the way, where I would just express my own view, which is sometimes different from Dima's and from other reporters, which is that we sometimes see these Russian advances in a particular area. For example, in Novomikhailivka, the Russians briefly occupied some territory immediately to the south of Novomikhailivka, and then they pulled out of it. And the assumption that many have made is that the Russians occupied this territory in order to launch an advance into Novomikhailivka itself from the south, and that they pulled back. When they pulled back, it was because that attack failed, and the Ukrainians then had successfully counterattacked. I think that we simply don't know, at least I don't know, what the thinking of the various commanders is in these situations. And it could be that sometimes, given the sort of thrust and parry with which a lot of this military this conflict has been conducted, much of this thrust and parry, some of these advances and retreats, the one in Sinkovka, which I discussed earlier, this other one in Novomikhailivka, that they might have been intentional, that the idea might have been, occupy territory, oblige the Ukrainians to redeploy forces to try to um, block an advance there. That will then weaken Ukrainian positions in other places. You can then move into those other places. And when you then see the ground back to the Ukrainians are more exposed and you can conduct more of your aggressive attrition upon them. I am not saying this, with any certitude. As I said, I'm not an expert in these kind of things. Um, I do sometimes feel that things that appear to have happened at random might sometimes have been more carefully planned in advance. I mean, I have often seen situations, for example, in legal conflicts where parties appear to concede points, which in fact put them in a superior position overall. Same thing happens in chess. And, it does occur to me sometimes that some of what we see on the battlefronts may be maybe things like that. Anyway, that's again a deteriorating picture for the Ukrainians. So in Kupiansk, in Bakhmut, in Avdiivka, in the Marinka area, situation for the Ukrainians deteriorating again after the Christmas lull, and the Russians once more pushing forward. And I will finish this roundup of information from the battlefront by saying that there has also been a film published, I don't quite know by whom, but it originates with a Ukrainian soldier who filmed the area in Krinky, this small bridgehead on the east bank of the Dnieper River, which the Ukrainians have now occupied for several months. Anyway, it shows the landscape, and it is a scene of absolute devastation. I mean, the churned up mud, shattered trees, not a single building anywhere in sight. Um, it really does remind me of some of the pictures from places in the First World War, Passchendaele and the Somme and places like that. I mean, it is a hellish picture. And the Ukrainian command continuing to send troops into Krinky. I mean, hardly any cover left. Ukrainians have dug some trenches, but I mean, this must be providing only a limited amount of cover. But the Ukrainians continuing to pour men into this ever shrinking bridgehead, which has been reduced to this situation. I find it incomprehensible. And I think more and more people in Ukraine find it incomprehensible as well. Now, there have been many more reports of Ukraine about people complaining about the effect of the Russian aggressive attrition. There's been protests in Khmelnytsky from the families of Ukrainian soldiers complaining bitterly about the fact that many of their loved ones have been thrown into battle with insufficient training. There was the comments by Hannah Malyar that I spoke about yesterday. She actually specifically says that the Russians are not allowing the Ukrainians any rest. They're not giving the Ukrainians any time to refit and resupply and rebuild their forces, that they're hammering away all the time on the battlefronts, and that they're pushing on every part of the line of contact in order to keep the pressure on the Ukrainians all the time. And she also spoke about the heavy discrepancy in artillery power between the Russians and the Ukrainians. But we've now had more comments about this from various Ukrainian channels. I think Resident had one. All of them cumulatively saying that the situation on the battlefront is becoming worse and worse for the Ukrainians by the day. They may be holding positions, and it's important to stress that these Russian attacks so far, except perhaps in the Avdiivka area, have been conducted with relatively small forces. The Ukrainians may be holding positions, but they're doing so by exhausting what remains of their strength. And this is causing enormous problems for the Ukrainian army and for the soldiers who are obliged to hold their positions in the face of this relentless Russian pressure. And behind it all, one gets, well, not perhaps, I hesitate to use words like despair. I mean, there continues to be, on the part of many Ukrainian soldiers, still sufficient will to go on fighting. But there appears to be a growing sense of fatalism and abandonment and a belief that this can't go on for very much longer. In fact, I recall that some videos ago, I actually quoted the words of a Ukrainian soldier speaking to a Western journalist and actually admitting as much. And to reiterate again, Ukraine has no plan. Zelensky, Zaluzhny have no plan about what to do about this. Nor does anybody in the West. There's been a very interesting commentary about where the West has got to. The West's situation with respect to the conflict in Ukraine. In Izvestia, the Russian newspaper. Of course, this is a Russian take, and I'll just read it. It says that the European Union continues to consider Ukrainian President Zelensky's so-called peace formula as the only way to settle the Ukrainian crisis. Peter Stano, the European Commission's lead spokesman for foreign affairs and security policy, told Izvestia, essentially, the formula is the only approach being promoted by the West, despite the fact that Moscow has rejected it as not reflective of the actual state of affairs. Experts, and we must assume that means Russian experts, insist that the strategy of European and Euro-Atlantic structures has hit a dead end. While problems are apparent with finding sources of further financing of the Kiev regime, the West is still pledging to provide Kiev with billions more in aid, according to a recent extraordinary meeting of the NATO-Ukrainian Council in Brussels. And the article then goes on to say that tensions in Europe are growing amid the uncertain fate of further Ukraine financing. But nonetheless, there is no other plan. There is no real idea of what to do. And the article goes on to quote Denisov, an expert at the financial university under the government of the Russian Federation, as saying that we are seeing a total dead end in the negotiating in the negotiating field. Until the West changes its stance on this, any talks are simply out of the question. And Denisov then goes on to say the collective West is not ready to reach a moral compromise or to seek solutions towards achieving a full-fledged, comprehensive settlement of the conflict, and therefore it is obvious that the EU and NATO together and separately are still placing their bets on achieving results through the continuation of combat operations by their wholly subsidized Ukrainian proxy. So the Russians are saying, West, out of ideas, they've got themselves into a dead end, they can't negotiate, they find it impossible to negotiate, they're too divided amongst each other to really countenance negotiations, but ultimately they lack the means, they lack the resources to achieve on the battlefront, that which their stance logically requires. And I think this is absolutely correct. So it's completely understandable why, having reached this dead end, the Russians, for their part, see no need to discuss negotiations, to come up with any peace proposals of their own. All they need to do is to insist that they will fulfill the objectives that Putin set at the start of the special military operation. They can remain ambiguous about their final objectives because, as far as they're concerned, they have no reason to discontinue the war or to seek a ceasefire because in the air and on the ground, things are going their way. And all the indications are that they not only will continue to do so, but that they will do so to an ever greater degree, and that is understood increasingly in Ukraine as well, amongst the wider population, amongst the commentary class that publishes its views in places like Strana and in the various Telegram channels, if not yet with the Ukrainian government, with people like Zelensky and his officials. I will finish this roundup of Ukrainian-related news by saying that Dmitry Medvedev, who is the deputy chair of Russia's Security Council, has now published his latest rather strong commentary. All his commentaries now are extremely strong, discussing what might happen if Ukraine is indeed supplied by these long-range cruise missiles that some people are talking about, and given the green light to strike at targets deep inside Russia with these cruise missiles. And by the way, on that front, over the course of Zelensky's visit to the Baltic states, I noticed that the Prime Minister of Estonia actually says that Ukraine should be provided with these sort of weapons and should be allowed perfect freedom to use them as it chooses, including through deep strikes far into Russia itself. Anyway, Medvedev has reminded everybody that if this were to happen, then all sorts of provisions of Russian military doctrine would start to come to effect. The Russians would be justified in taking all sorts of measures, up to and including use of nuclear weapons, in order to counter what would then undoubtedly have become a threat to their own territory by any estimation. Now, I don't actually think that the Russians are actually contemplating use of nuclear weapons or anything like that. But to repeat a point which I think I have made before, if the West supplies long-range missiles to Ukraine and does so with the express purpose of allowing Ukraine to launch strikes deep into Russia, then in terms of what the West would have done, it would be an act of war against Russia. Supplying those kind of weapons to a third party so that that third party can attack another country deep inside another country is a classic act of war. Now, whether people in the West understand that or not, I don't know. The Russians would have perfect legal rights to counter it if they found themselves in that kind of situation. It would be a very, very dangerous thing to do indeed. And as a commentator on the Financial Times, a professor at Cornell University pointed out, with respect to this plan to seize Russian assets, providing long-range missiles to Ukraine in order to enable Ukraine to strike deep into Russia would dangerously erode the boundary between war and peace. It would be the kind of act which would all but amount to the declaration of something very close to a state of war between the West and Russia. So, again, I don't know whether this has been properly understood in the West, but we are coming very, very close to making some very dangerous decisions. I'm sure the Russians can counter them. They've shown astonishing self-control up to this point, but the fact that the Russians are showing self-control is not a grounds for pushing those boundaries between war and peace beyond that point where it becomes unclear whether we are in a state of peace or in a state of war with a nuclear-armed superpower like Russia. Now, I'm going to now turn briefly to what is going on in the other places of conflict. The first is that there's been obviously these missile strikes on Yemen. I've seen loads of commentaries now across the Western media, which do appear to concede that these missile strikes, by definition, are going to have only limited effectiveness. There was even one Western expert who actually said that the Houthis probably want a wider war in the Middle East, that it works to their political advantage, and that these missile strikes upon them, to the extent that they brought that wider war closer, actually fits well into the Houthis' agenda. There's been a massive protest in Sana'a, the capital of Yemen. Apparently up to 1 million people were there. I can't obviously confirm that, but the film I've seen is pretty impressive. Anyway, there doesn't seem to be much sign of people in Yemen being deterred. And if it is indeed the case that their capability has been hardly dented and that this missile strike works to their purposes, then what exactly was the point of launching those missile strikes at all? Well, I'm not going to go over this again. I've discussed this at length in previous programs. It seems to me that whether, again, they understand it or not, the Western powers, the Biden administration, and the British government climbed onto the escalatory escalator, and it is very, very difficult once you do that to get off, and you could be heading before very long to a wider war in the Middle East, which you absolutely do not need, and potentially a war with Iran, which you do not need either. Even as that is happening, we've now had detailed arguments presented to the International Court of Justice. I have been reading through the transcripts of this. I suspect we will get a decision fairly quickly from the International Court of Justice. I think the decision is probably finely balanced, not because, to my mind, there's any real doubt about what the International Court of Justice ought to do in this situation. Not reach a final decision, but certainly issue a instruction to Israel or a request to Israel, call it whatever you like, to desist from further action, because it does look as if there is at least grounds to think that the conditions of the plaint that South Africa has brought, I'm using my words very carefully, has been met. But I'm not absolutely convinced, for all kinds of reasons, that the court will do it. As I've said, they are located in The Hague. They are susceptible to all kinds of persuasion. Anyway, we'll just have to wait and see. But certainly, I think the exercise of bringing this case in the first place has renewed the pressure on Israel and on the West. It has also brought into contention for much of the global South the value of these legal institutions in The Hague. And that's perhaps something to be borne in mind, given that across the global South, most people by now have clearly formed their views. And of course, if there is a decision, even a relatively weak decision from the Hague Court against Israel over the next couple of days, that will be profoundly embarrassing indeed, and might lead to wider consequences. And at the very least, it will result in renewed action in the General Assembly. I would point out that South Africa is a BRICS state, that the BRICS have been coordinating closely over the events in Gaza for some time. I don't think that is open to any doubt. I would not be surprised if the application to the International Court of Justice by South Africa has been coordinated and agreed by that country with the other BRICS states. And if the BRICS states might not already have a plan for what to do in the United Nations, in the General Assembly, if the court in The Hague actually does issue some sort of order against Israel in the next couple of days. Just saying. But anyway, let's wait and see what the court itself decides. Anyway, the United States, Britain on an escalatory escalator in the Middle East. And of course, they're clambering further up the escalatory escalator in the Asia Pacific region, because, as I discussed yesterday, the pro-independence party has won the presidential election in Taiwan, as, by the way, I expected. And already the United States is talking about sending more delegations of Congress people to Taiwan. The United States is pushing forward, apparently, with a plan to re-equip Taiwan's army with $10 billion worth of weapons. President Xi Jinping of China gave a strong warning against these moves in his New Year's address a few weeks ago. But it seems that just as in the Middle East, just as before then in Ukraine, having got onto the escalator, the Western powers find it impossible to get off. So a crisis looming in Taiwan, a crisis already in the Middle East, a debacle now just over the horizon in Ukraine. And no one with a clue what to do. The Russians picking up, as that article in Izvestia shows, the utter bankruptcy of Western policy with respect to Ukraine, its complete lack of realism, and the way in which the West has no other plan other than to go on reinforcing failure in Ukraine itself, and a situation in the Middle East which is becoming precarious and which, well, a decision by a court might conceivably, over the next couple of days, make more precarious still, and a crisis, a completely avoidable crisis, looming over Taiwan, which, again, the United States seems to have no ability to change course over. Well, we will see what happens. I've never known a situation quite like this myself. I ought to say that I appreciate that in the United States, elections are supposed to be decided principally by economic matters. I think that the American people do need to understand that there is a direct connection between the economic situation in the United States and the geopolitical policies that the United States is following, and that without much discussion or understanding, policies are being enacted by the US at the present time, or at least the people who are in control of policy in the US, which are dangerous for the United States and which will have consequences for the American people themselves. And I think that that, more than any other issue, ought to inform the election. But obviously, what I think might not have much bearing on what actually happens. We shall have to wait and see. In the meantime, let me say that this is the end of my program today. Be more from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget also to check out our shop where you can find all the amazing things that are there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.